and welcome to the next edition of the Weichert Reports podcast. I'm Brandon Weichert, and I'm going to discuss with you a little bit more about the upcoming, in I believe 6 days now, it feels like it's been going on forever, American presidential election for 2016, the battle between Democrat Hillary Rodham Clinton and Republican Donald J. Trump. If you hear any crickets in the background, it's because I am enjoying a lovely Virginian night in our backyard, so forgive me if there's some ambient noise. The drink tonight is a nice Chianti, and let's talk politics. So, as you know from my previous podcast on the subject, I am quite convinced that the polling data is flawed. I think that Donald Trump is actually poised to win this thing. I think, I based a lot of that off of the fact that the polling agencies, at least the major ones, were oversampling Democrats and women, and they were also the media organizations, the mainstream media organizations, were amplifying anecdotal evidence. For instance, there was a story about one or two millennials in places like Chicago or in Ohio coming out and saying that they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton, despite the fact that they were lifelong Republicans, and the media was somehow trying to extrapolate and make that into a larger story than it was. I think there are a couple things here the polls are missing. I think that there are about 3 to 5 million registered voters who do not normally vote, consistently at least, certainly sat out the last two presidential election cycles. Any pollster will tell you that they've noticed that this number vacillates from 3 to 5 million, and it is a known quantity that there are about that number of people who should be voting, but for whatever reason opt not to. These people now are being galvanized. Now, these voters tend to be a little bit on the, I don't want to say radical, but I definitely want to say a little bit on the unorthodox side. They don't agree with the kind of sacred dogmas that dominate our discourse today. And what I mean by that is they are skeptical of free trade agreements. They are very concerned about the economic situation, not just for themselves or their communities, but also for the overall country. They are completely turned off by the bipartisan consensus that it's okay to be engaged in 5 endless wars. Both Democrats and Republicans have, been doing this. There's obviously, anybody who knows the Weichert Report and reads me consistently understands that there's context to be given, and it's not entirely fair to blame either George W. Bush or Barack Obama for the kind of listlessness in terms of the wars that we're fighting. But we at the Weichert Report also understand that most Americans, I think, viscerally understand that 5 wars at a time is not conducive to the national interest, especially when the wars are not yielding the kind of strategic gains that they should be. In fact, in the case of the Middle East, it's getting worse, not better. So, anyway, these voters are turned off by the wars. And these voters are also culturally, they're an interesting mix, because you have culturally some groups that are more traditional social conservatives, but you also have a hodgepodge of groups. Some of them would be considered libertarians, people who do not place as much emphasis on traditional cultural issues as the so-called social cons do, but they are disheartened by the explosion of drug use. They don't necessarily agree with the over-sexualization of what they perceive to be the over-sexualization of the American culture. and they don't. These are people who really don't take an active role, and so these people are not going to really. The polls are not going to be well served, because if these people have been checking out of the electoral process for at least two election cycles, it's likely they're also not going to be partaking in, consistently, at least in polls. So there's something that the polls are missing already. As we've heard in the last 48 hours, we now know, and anybody who works in polling knows that this is a fact, that much of the polling data goes off of the trends of the last election cycle. So, for instance, now Terry, if you're out there, you know that we just recently had a little tete-a-tete over this issue. I have long been skeptical of the modeling system that most pollsters use, because, for instance, if you're looking at the 2012 or even the 2008 election, you're getting a skewed image of certain groups that turned out the way that they did for Barack Obama. As we've seen now with reports coming out of the Carolinas and elsewhere, and definitely in Ohio, the African American vote is not galvanized the way it was for Barack Obama. It's probably not even galvanized the way it was for Bill Clinton, who, as we all know, Maya Angelou, the great black poet, once described him as America's first black president. That was, of course, before Barack Obama. So the voter enthusiasm is a real issue, and my previous podcast touched upon that to a degree. But I think it's very important, as I have said for many years now, American elections are really a tale of how galvanized the two parties' bases are. And I think it's safe to say that since 2008, the Republican Party's base has not been galvanized. It's been haphazardly galvanized at different uncoordinated times. For instance, with the rise of the Tea Party movement in 2010, the midterm elections that we've had success in, but then the 2012 election came around, and for whatever reason, those people that were so ready to go for the Tea Party candidates in 2010 were not ready to go for Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. So, and meanwhile, especially if you look at 2012, the so-called Obama coalition of minorities and other special interest groups like the gay community were galvanized, as really very, very rarely happens, as never before. And so that kind of gave Mr. Obama an edge electorally. I don't see that happening for Hillary. This was a particularly contentious Democratic primary process. So I'm not surprised that coming out of the 2016 Democratic primary, there would be a degree of disenchantment with the Democrat nominee, particularly in the wake of the WikiLeaks WikiLeaks scandal, which showed over the summer that indeed the DNC primary was literally rigged in Hillary's favor. It caused Debbie Wasserman Schultz, a representative out of Florida who was the head of the DNC at the time, it forced her into resigning, and it's caused a lot of fallout. We now know, I am quite convinced that we can now say for sure that there is a core contingent of Bernie Sanders supporters, the kind of the militant leftist types, the Ben and Jerry crowd. Of course, Ben and Jerry is supporting Hillary, but that type from the Northeast, the kind of I call them the true leftists, the people that you just know are never going to vote for anyone other than a socialist. They are a core contingent of the Democrat base, and they were in 2008 and 12. They were very much galvanized behind Barack Obama, who was, in many respects, a transformational candidate. Hillary is not so much. Yes, Hillary is the first female to have a chance, kind of, at winning, but she essentially cheated to get to the position that she got to. And now it is being revealed that there's a litany of other scandals. And now we're finding out that this email scandal, the FBI probe, of course, is now being blown wide open again. The FBI is reopening their investigation. And all these things are now compounding for the Clinton campaign in an unfortunate way for them, because there's, I think, 5 or 6 days left now. People are already starting to vote. You talk about October surprise. There's been a litany of October surprises, none of them good. Every time the Clintons think they can nip Donald Trump with one of his statements, of course, that blows up in their face, because there's 2 or 3 other announcements made about Hillary Clinton's and the overall Clinton campaign's kind of misdeeds. So there's a lot of suppression going on, or rather, there's a lack of turnout going on, because the Democrat base, I believe, is becoming increasingly disenfranchised by their nominee. If you just look at the turnout for the different rallies for Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine versus Donald Trump and Mike Pence, there's no comparison. And as I said in the previous podcast, if there is even half of the voters turning out for those Trump-Pence rallies, if even half of them turn out to vote for Hillary, I'm pretty sure it's going to be over for Hillary. So the polls are not taking into certain things into account. Donald Trump is also riding an international wave of anti-globalization sentiment. The 2008 recession eviscerated the global economy. And now the left continues to say that we're in this incredible jobs recovery, but I look around and I'm seeing my fellow millennials saddled with debt from school, getting degrees that will never yield any type of economic prosperity. And then they get out into the workforce, and to paraphrase Hillary Clinton, the best they can do is become a barista at Starbucks. That's not a economy that is sustainable to most people, at least. And that's how it's being felt here, but elsewhere it's being felt much more significantly, even in places like Europe. Look at Spain. The government literally collapsed there, and there's been a litany of economic crises that have consumed, in different ways, different parts of the globe, and it is really causing a huge pushback against globalization from countries that ordinarily are strong proponents of it. The foreign policy issue is another issue that as I've stated before, we're engaged technically. I mean, if you really look at it technically, we are engaged in 5 major wars right now. We have troops deployed. We have aircraft bombing. We have enormous amounts of money that we really don't have going into funding major conflicts, particularly in the Middle East. And there doesn't seem to be a strategy for victory on the part of the Democrats. The Taliban are on the march in Helmand province, as I wrote recently on the Weikert Report. They are launching major offensives against Afghan national security forces in Afghanistan's western provinces. They are likely going to retake the spiritual capital of the Taliban in Kandahar, which is, I think, the 2nd or 3rd largest city in Afghanistan, which we took with relative ease in 2001. So things are not looking well right now for the overall state of foreign policy. The EU is slowly, I believe, crumbling before our eyes. NATO is under pressure, not just from Russia, but from the fact that each time a crisis pops up internationally, particularly involving NATO, NATO is never really quite responsive in the way it should be. I mean, look at Afghanistan. They've been there, yes, but I'm not quite sure how NATO really made a significant difference with all of their restrictive rules of engagement, ROEs. Look at the mess that's been made. I mean, in Ukraine, we've managed, because of American leadership, we've managed to kind of keep Russia at bay, but only kind of. Putin seems to be quite serious about taking back at least eastern Ukraine, and his forces are poised to do so, and I suspect he's going to do so when the U.S. presidency changes hands, whoever it's going to be, whether it's Trump or Hillary, particularly if it's Hillary, given his personal animosity toward her and his belief that she is the ringleader of this grand conspiracy within the West to dismantle Russia. So the problems that we're facing, I think the American people are generally of the mind that Hillary Clinton is not going to be able to resolve them. And you couple the fact that there are 3 to 5 million voters who normally do not vote, and they all seem, majority of them seem to be orienting toward Donald Trump and Mike Pence. You take into account that the polling data is skewing a lot of the coverage, the reportage. You take into account the fact that the Democrat base is not galvanized the way that they were for the Obama coalition. As I said to a colleague not long ago, when they were asking who I thought was going to win, this was about, 13 months ago, 12 months ago, I told them it's going to depend on whose base shows up. You know, Matthew Dowd, he's on ABC frequently. He's kind of one of one of the representatives of status quo inside the Beltway establishment thinking. He's a nominal Republican, but he worked for George W. Bush and as a pollster, and he did a very, very interesting study after the 2000 election when he was trying to figure out how the recount crisis happened. And one thing that he found was that the old saw in political science about, elections, you have to run to the middle in a presidential general election, because the middle is where the great unwashed exist and where they're going to, decide the election. He actually found that those who were quote unquote undecided, the percentage was a hell of a lot smaller than what most academicians believed. And that really most people had made up their minds as to whether they were going to vote Republican or Democrat consistently. And when they decided to vote, they were predisposed toward whatever either of the two parties. What you're seeing with Donald Trump, however, is a phenomenon that you saw with Ronald Reagan, in which many Democrats are switching parties in key swing states like Pennsylvania, like Florida. I can think of 7 small business owners that I know in Florida who are switching parties from Democrat, and they employ about 80 to 100 people. They are switching from the Democrat Party to vote, or either I think they have voted now for Donald Trump. Peter Thiel is another great. He's out of Silicon Valley. He's gay. He by everything on paper he should be your typical Democrat donor, but he's in fact one of the most eloquent, outspoken supporters of Donald Trump. And I think it's because there's a sense in this country, and I'm not the only one to say it, that the status quo is not working. And Matthew Dowd found that the percentage of undecideds are much smaller. And so what I extrapolate from that study, and I think it's actually gotten a lot narrower since 2000. And I think what you find is, I think that the quote-unquote undecideds, the moderates, independents, they are very instrumental. But I think what's really important is if you have a strong, consistent message that resonates with most people, and if your candidate is, for lack of a better term, if they have a degree of celebrity around them, like Reagan did, like Trump did. Even George W. Bush, because of the family name, but also because of the fact that he was so different. He was so dissimilar from his father, and he was the guy that everybody wanted to have a beer with, despite the fact that he was a born-again Christian who had gave up alcohol, years before he ran. But he was that was the persona. He was the cowboy, and people liked that, as opposed to the stilted Al Gore. So there's that, and I think that the undecideds that the left in particular and those in the media are hoping to sway. I think there's a lot fewer of them, and I think that the fact that you're having even a small percentage of Democrats jump ship, either because they're disenfranchised from what happened to Bernie Sanders, or they just don't like Hillary. They don't think that the status quo is working. I think that's going to bring a lot of those quote-unquote undecideds along with them. Remember, I think undecideds are looking for consistent, clear messaging with consistent, decisive examples of leadership. And Donald Trump is brimming, whether you agree with him or not. And I certainly have my disagreements, with him. But he is decisive, and he has that brash New York style. Hillary Clinton is mired in corruption. She's mired in a lot of scandal. And then there's also the old political science, saw that the electorate is predisposed to vote against the incumbent party after 2 terms of any party. So we saw it with, and very often we find, many studies have been written on this in my field of political science, we find that the party leaders, or the presidents of each party, are elected in response, in some way, on the part of the electorate, in response to their predecessor. So, for instance, think of it this way. Richard Nixon was seen as a corrupt, lying, all-around bad guy. Now, we went through Gerald Ford, but Gerald Ford didn't make a second term. Jimmy Carter was kind of the next big answer on the part of the electorate. And Jimmy Carter was a born-again Christian, evangelical, or Baptist rather, Southern Baptist, Sunday school preacher who was probably one of the most honest men, a peanut farmer turned president, a nuclear scientist turned president. In many ways, he was a response to what the voters perceived, and he was also a dove, and he was very much, although he did not govern as a dove, but he was very much perceived by the American electorate as an honest man, which is a direct answer to, or antithesis to, the perception of not just Nixon, but also Ford, who many were upset for pardoning Nixon. When Carter was a failure in the eyes of the American people, Ronald Reagan came in. Pardon me. And Ronald Reagan became he was everything that Carter was not. Bill Clinton was very much a response to H.W. Bush. George W. Bush was a response to, Bill Clinton. George W. Bush was he was a brash, plain-talking Texan governor who was another born-again Christian, which is in direct opposition to what Bill Clinton ended up being. And in fact, I remember when Tony Blair came to the United States he went to the Chicago Economic Club and gave a speech in 1998 or 99 in which he just lambasted Bill Clinton for not taking more decisive leadership over the Kosovo issue. And it was on moral grounds that he was saying that the UK and US needed to hit the Serbs because of the massacres that was going on. The polling conducted by the Wall Street Journal after that speech was that a majority of Americans, and mind you, this was going on during the Lewinsky scandal, the majority of American people would have preferred Tony Blair as their president than Bill Clinton. And so George W. Bush was a response to that. And after 8 years of George W. Bush, Barack Obama he ran as the anti-Bush, not just because of the fact that he was the first serious black candidate from either party, but also because he represented, at least how he talked, in terms of what he believed in, he represented the antithesis to George W. Bush's supposed, warmongering, economic idiocy in the eyes of the left and many people, and his kind of traditional conservatism. Obama was an antithesis to that. So after 8 years of that, and with mixed results to say the least, we now have Donald Trump, who is the exact opposite in many ways of Obama, not just because of the skin color, but also in terms of age, also in terms of disposition, and in terms of rhetoric. And so that is what's going on in this election. I think there's a lot of trends that are working that are not being picked up by most mainstream polls that are working in Donald Trump's favor. The next issue is how are they going to govern? I think under Donald Trump, I think you're going to have a series of things going on. I think the first thing you're going to see is there's going to be a reorientation of strategic thinking in the military realm. I think we're going to become much more clear-eyed and focused on destroying the Islamic State. I think he's going to resolve the Afghan war. I think it's going to end up with us pulling out, maybe maintaining some forces to do what Biden wanted to do in 2009, which was the CT plus strategy. But I don't think we're going to do more than CT's counterterrorism. I don't think we're going to do more than that. I think that Donald Trump in foreign policy will also, through strength, or at least the perception, he will be perceived as strong by both the Russians and Chinese, and I think as such, it's going to make the Chinese and Russians a bit more reticent to take the provocative actions that they've been taking against President Obama. Personalities matter, and even though in our system we don't tend to respond to forceful personalities the same way that, say, a culture like China or Russia or Iran would, we must not forget that there are several leaders out there who come from completely different cultures, who are autocratic, who are totalitarian, who are militaristic, who are revanchist, who do not communicate or perceive the world with the same kind of rosy eyes that most Western leaders do. And I think Donald Trump is going to be much better at speaking kind of that universal tough guy language. And I'm sorry to put it like that. I don't want to sound like a misogynist, but I do think that there is something to be said, especially when dealing with rulers like Putin or President Xi or Rouhani and the mullahs in Iran, or even Kim Jong-un. I think there's something to be said for that kind of very clear-cut, concise worldview of we're America, we're tough, and we're gonna do what we have to do for our national interests. So I would expect a series of reorientations in our strategic thought. Like I said in the previous podcast, I think there is going to be a reassessment to a degree of our relationship with NATO and with other countries like Japan and South Korea, but especially with Asia, because I know some of the people who have floated policy proposals to the Trump campaign on Asia. I really am not so much concerned for Japan. I would be more concerned, for instance, for South Korea, particularly because they seem to be buddying up with China, which is problematic for our foreign policy. So I would expect the South Koreans to have to make a decision on certain things, and I would expect Trump to come down a little bit harder on them. But I think in terms of the Asian issues, I don't think Trump is going to be as divisive. I don't think he's going to be as quixotic either as the Obama administration has in terms of the pivot. And I also think, again, because of his contacts with China and because of the fact that his perception among fellow world leaders will be, here's a man of action, here's a tough guy, particularly in the first 100 days of his presidency. I think that you're going to see leaders like Xi, particularly with the bubble that's getting ready to burst over in China and the slowing growth going on over there and some of the that's not being reported, some of the unrest going on. I think you're going to see that the Chinese try to maybe cool tensions down. The same thing with Russia. If Russia does take action against eastern Ukraine or any of the Baltics, I think it is a grave miscalculation on the part of Putin because, first of all, Trump is not, as the FBI has come out and said, Trump is not an agent of the Kremlin. And he has made it clear, I think, when he said that Putin's not going into Ukraine, I think what Trump was meaning was he was putting Putin on notice that we're not going to tolerate it. So I think if Putin's thinking that Trump is going to be somehow a pushover, all he has to do is say a couple nice things about Trump and things will go well. I think he's going to be very, very upset. And I especially know from former Soviet experts that used to work at the DIA, I also know that their contacts in Russia are actually quite concerned about a Trump presidency for the simple fact that whereas Hillary Clinton or even another Republican, i.e. Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, their actions can be anticipated, their actions can be, their actions are programmatic, their responses to certain Russian provocations and actions abroad are programmatic and again can be anticipated. With Trump, who is not a programmatic conservative and he's not an establishment Republican, and he seems to hold almost a Pat Buchanan-esque worldview. That I think has its pros and cons, and it makes it for the Russians. It makes it much more difficult for them to anticipate what Mr. Trump might do in the event that they say annex another part of Ukraine or they take over part of Moldova or what have you. I think for the economy, as I stated, I think that if you listen to guys like Larry Kudlow, I think that there's a lot of benefits to his economic policies, especially for millennials, especially for middle Americans who are feeling the squeeze. I don't know if we're going to ever be able to stop automation. Jim Pethokoukis wrote a great article. I disagree with a lot of I disagree with his conclusion of not voting for Trump as a conservative. He wrote an article at Vox.com yesterday or the day before, and he talked extensively about some of the economic issues that are going to be plaguing America and the rest of the world for the rest of the century, which primarily orbit around automation. So I don't hear Trump talking about that, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to get back to even 1980s levels of growth. But if we can get even halfway there, we will be much better off. And I think that our population density being the way it is, I think we are the best suited to capitalize on that. And if you listen to guys like Larry Kudlow, who have looked at Mr. Trump's tax plan, if you've looked at his economic plan, this is going to be the greatest boon for the American economy compared to Hillary's. The downside is I think we're adding, what was it, 535 maybe, $500 billion in deficit spending, which will likely go up higher once he starts implementing plans. But compare that to the over $1 trillion of deficit spending coupled with high taxes that Mrs. Clinton wants to impose upon an already strapped American economy. The guys at the top aren't going to feel it. The people at the bottom, well, they're just going to have more people joining them because the middle class is going to be destroyed under such policies. And without a thriving middle class, the country is going to be very, 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 very difficult to be it's going to find it very difficult to be prosperous, which means we can't fund military operations, which means our national security is threatened, innovation is threatened. It's just really bad. So I think people are awake to that notion, and I think that there's all of these things are combining to give Trump the edge. But what's needed, frankly, is people need to get out and vote. Vote for your conscience, as they say. But I do think that Trump has the advantage right now. I think that Hillary is losing this one. And I think if trends persist over the next 6 days, influencing the election, I think that President Trump is more likely than not. And that has some downsides to it. Definitely has some downsides to it. But I think the upsides for the immediate term are much greater. I would expect, though, and now I had this conversation about 8 months ago with a colleague of mine, former colleague of mine from the Hill, who is not a Trump supporter, but is a Republican. I told him, I said, I would not be surprised if in the first 6 to 8 months of a Trump presidency, because Donald Trump, I think, has to understand how, I don't think he understands how our federal government system, our system works. I don't think he understands that you cannot rule by fiat, despite what Barack Obama has tried to do. And I think that if he does try to do something, say fire a bunch of federal employees, or you name it, something that he thinks he can do through an executive decree, or if Congress doesn't pass one of his pet projects and he tries to enact part of it or all of it through executive order, I really could foresee not the Democrats, but the Republicans leading the charge to impeach him. And I think there could be a constitutional crisis because of that, because I think that there is a huge oncoming civil war within the Republican Party, and I think it's going to have serious ramifications, not just for the future of the party, but it's going to have serious ramifications for the future electoral system, how we have elections, and I think it's going to have severe reactions or consequences for how the country looks at the two-party system, as in there won't be a two-party system anymore. You're going to have a de facto third party. You're going to have those who support Trump, and then you're going to have everyone else in the Republican Party, and then you're going to have the Democrat Party. So this will have consequences. But if we can pull it out, I think that a President Trump will be a better solution than a President Hillary Clinton, who's going to be facing the prospect of not only being the first woman president, but will likely be the first president to have to pardon herself due to this FBI investigation. Or failing that, she will be so unpopular and have such little political capital that she's not going to be able to get anything done anyway. And she will be perceived not just by other American leaders, but by the rest of the world as a weak leader right out of the gate. And that's the last thing we should want as Americans. So that is my take. We've got 5 days now left. Get out there and vote. Vote for your conscience. I do think that I think that the world needs to prepare for a President Trump, and like I said in the previous podcast, the other countries in NATO and in Asia in particular need to start making calculations based on that. Trump has a very transactional view on foreign policy. That's not all bad, but it's going to be possibly these countries are going to have to be definitely paying more to play, as it were, if they expect American support. I think with the NATO issue, I think that what Mr. Trump should say is, hey, look, if NATO is not serious, these countries are not serious about putting a minimal 2% of their GDP into funding NATO operations, into funding, NATO military forces, that's fine. But we're also going to rethink Article 5, because frankly, it's a little ridiculous. But that's another podcast coming very soon. For the Weichert Report, I'm Brandon Weichert. This has been another one of our podcasts, and it's been a pleasure talking to you tonight. Enjoy the evening if you're living anywhere near Virginia. It's a beautiful night tonight. Thank you.